Hi, everybody. My name is Erica Wright with the Oklahoma Rural Schools Coalition, and we are so excited to have all of you joining us this evening as we join our friends from the National Rural Education Association and the researchers to present to us the data around the Why Rural Matters 2023 report. A couple of items for housekeeping. We do have the chat box. If you have questions that you think of as we're going through the presentation, please put those in the chat box and we'll address those at the end so that we don't derail the presentation on the data. And then if you could go ahead. So this morning I sent you guys a reminder and I emailed you my link. So a lot of you are logged in under my name. So if you could go ahead and pull up your chat box and type your name and where you're from in there, just so that we have a better idea of who is on the call with us, that would be fantastic. So let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead. Most of you on here already know me, and so I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Dr. Melissa Sadorf and let her introduce herself. She's with NREA and she's going to kick us off. So Melissa, Dr. Sadorf, it's all yours.
Thank you, Erica. It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. As Erica said, I am Melissa Sadorf. I'm president of the National Rural Education Association, and I'm here tonight on behalf of our executive director, Dr. Alan Pratt. And as a rural school district superintendent in Arizona who advocates very strongly for rural education in my state and my region, I was very excited about this latest release of the Why Rural Matters report. The data that you're going to be hearing about tonight that's contained in this report is so useful when advocating for and talking about what's happening with our rural students in schools across the country, really focusing in on those important issues that are manifesting in our rural communities. The report also includes examples from states that have shown notable positive changes over time in terms of policy measures that are linked to desirable outcomes for our students, which can serve as a guide for the work that we're all doing in our individual states. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce two of the researchers that contributed to the report who will be speaking with you tonight. The first is Dr. Karen Epley, who is a teaching professor at Penn State, where she studies spatial equity. And we also have Dr. Daniel Showalter, who is an assistant professor of mathematics at Eastern Mennonite University. And unlike me, loves diving into data sets. Math's not my strength, but especially ones that are related to rural education. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you to take us from here.
Okay. So Dr. Showalter, did you want to go ahead and share your screen? Great. Perfect.
Good evening from Pennsylvania. It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about the release of Why Rural Matters 2023, Centering Equity and Opportunity. We'll be providing an overview of the report with specific implications for Oklahoma. Why Rural Matters is a national report, first conceptualized by the Rural School and Community Trust in 1999. The 2023 version is the 10th in the series. Its purpose then and now is to provide a publicly accessible accounting of the context and conditions of rural education across the United States. The report is based on public data, and its goal is to provide data about the strengths and opportunities for growth for rural schools. The report is used by policymakers, practitioners, and researchers, and gets some national media attention as well. The most recent version was commissioned by the National Rural Education Association and connects to NREA's newest research agenda, which we'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. But something else to know about this version of Why Rural Matters is it includes a new gauge called Access to Supports for Learning and Development. The 5 indicators in this gauge provide information about well-being and equity. And finally, the report includes 2 special topic sections. The first is on the impact of COVID-19 on rural areas, and the second explains the connection between Why Rural Matters and the NREA Rural Research Agenda. Next, I'll explain a bit more about the connection of the report to NREA's Rural Research Agenda. This version of Why Rural Matters coincided with the release of NREA's newest Rural Research Agenda. The Rural Research Agenda was released in 2022 and charts a path for rural education research for the next 5 years, and you can link to it from the QR code on the screen. The NREA Rural Research Agenda centers spatial and educational equity with 5 interconnected themes that you can see on the graph. The first is policy and funding, teacher and school leader recruitment, retention, and preparation, college and career trajectory, community partnerships and relationships, and health and wellness. The core category in the center, spatial equity, is a term that captures the way that opportunities aren't distributed equitably across place. Spatial inequities impact the way that resources are allocated and services and educational opportunities are distributed across places. Now, Why Rural Matters has always been a report about spatial equity, but this year is the first that we have a gauge that explicitly measures access to supports, in part because of that alignment with the NREA Rural Research Agenda. Dan, will you talk a little bit about the data sources?
Yeah, sure. So there's no shortage of data available on the web, but we do maintain very high standards for the data that we use in our report. So first, we only use publicly available data, and this way any of our results can be replicated or checked by anyone who's interested in doing that. Second, we only use data that can be disaggregated by locale, and that way we can separate out the rural areas from the non-rural areas of the state. And third, once we have the data that meets the first 2 criteria, we try to pinpoint the indicators that are most relevant to stakeholders such as you all and to the health of rural education across the United States. We have a strong team at NREA and elsewhere brainstorming which data points to use, but we're also open to exploring new areas. So please feel free to suggest ideas to Karen or myself for upcoming reports, and you could just throw those in the chat if you'd like to, or we could talk about them at the end of this session here. So for the current report, the 5 data sources that we used can be seen on the screen, and the majority of our indicators are coming from the Common Core of Data, which is by the National Center for Education Statistics. EdFacts is where we get our graduation rates. That's U.S. Department of Education. The Office of Civil Rights had the data on gifted education. NAEP was the standardized testing data, and then EdData Express is a recent addition that houses data on multilingual learners, and I'll mention more about that in just a second. And the rest of the data then come through the American Community Survey, which is a smaller ongoing data collection system in between the 10-year censuses. So because there are several definitions of rural, it's important to talk about what we mean by rural when we're using the data in this report. So most of the indicators in this report use the National Center for Education Statistics set of 12 locale codes. So basically every area in the United States is labeled as one of these 12 locale codes, and 3 of these 12 are rural. There are some recent changes to the definition of rural, but what you see on the screen is currently the existing definition, and I'll mention how that's going to change here very soon. So you can see these areas that are densely clustered around 2,500 to 50,000 people. That's called an urban cluster. And then if you have more than 50,000 in a particular area, that's called an urban area. Anything outside of these would be rural. And then the further away it's located from one of these 2 determines the level of rural. So there's 3 levels of rural: fringe, distant, and remote. And in our report, we would be using all 3 of these levels. I thought it might be helpful to take a peek at Oklahoma and how these 12 locale codes play out. So you can see we have Oklahoma and some bordering states here, but Oklahoma City, of course, is urban area. Anything that's a shade of pink would be an urban area, and Tulsa also hits that. Looks like Lawton just barely reaches that urban criteria. And then you can see some suburbs around any area where there's urban. You can see the yellow areas, and those would be considered the official suburb by the NCES data terminology. And then if you peek around, it's a little harder to see here with the colors, but there's these blue little pockets. Stillwater would be considered a town, and several of them are not labeled, but you can see these other little blue dots. These would be towns because they were 2,500 or more people, and that's going to raise to 5,000, by the way. So right now, things that are labeled towns might become rural according to the official definition here within the next year or two. That's a change that's on the horizon. And then the rest of the state, all the shades of green, that's all rural. So any school that would be located in any of those three shades of green, you can see the fringe, the distant, and there's a lot of remote in that, especially in the southeastern area of Oklahoma. That would all be considered rural, remote. And the other shades of green would also be rural that we're using in the indicators in this report. And if you do have questions about any of this, I'm happy to go into more detail or specifics, but just throw those in the chat and we'll take a look after the main presentation. So the recent versions of the report has always maintained a set structure. We start with 5 big picture gauges, and I'll go over those in just a second. Each of these gauges is going to have 5 indicators. So that gives us 25 total indicators. We rank all the states that have sufficient data on these indicators and gauges, and then provide all the data, all the related data summaries in some visually appealing formats like maps and state pages. We then weave all of this together in a narrative, which is the main body of the report, followed by a couple special interest topics like Karen mentioned previously. In this current report, those are the COVID-19 impact and the NREA research agenda. And then as a kind of special add-on that came very late in this report, actually after the release that we had in Tennessee a couple months ago, we have a small additional section on multilingual learners, and I'll talk about that soon. So the 5 gauges, the first one is importance of rural education. And keep in mind that each of these is then going to be measured on 5 indicators. So importance of rural education. Well, I'll show you the 5 indicators soon and how Oklahoma came in on all of those. But basically, we're saying how big of a presence does rural have within a given state? That's what this first gauge is. Second one is diversity of rural students and their families. We're looking at racial diversity, but also economic diversity, learning. There's several different measures of diversity here. We're looking at the policy context over time. What are some of the policies that have been implemented? And we'll look at those for Oklahoma specifically here soon. The educational outcomes, mostly from the standardized testing, also graduation rates falls into this. Karen mentioned access to supports for learning and development of students in rural schools, and we'll look at Oklahoma's and all of these here very soon. Let me talk briefly about how the ranking system works, because this is, or it can be, somewhat confusing. So after we get the data for the rural areas of each state, we rank the state on that data. And it's not the type of competition like in the Olympics where you necessarily want to be first place, and you don't necessarily not want to be first place. First place just means this is an area that should be given some kind of priority, that for the limited resources we're dealing with, this is where there's more of a sense of urgency than things in the 30th places or 40th places. So that ranking system gives us a little sense of where Oklahoma will fit into the rest of the states in terms of their rural areas. It can also be used within a given state like Oklahoma to see where additional attention might be needed. So on all the 25 indicators, you can see where Oklahoma scored relatively well compared to the other states, and where there was more attention needed. One thing that's kind of interesting that we found over the years, although some states do have higher overall priority needs consistently, every state in the US always has areas they can be working on for improving the health of rural education in that state. So I'm going to turn things back over to you, Karen.
Thank you. Well, most of the data reports conditions in states, similar to what Dan was talking about, and how individual states compare to each other. We also report 6 key findings that capture national trends, and I'll review them briefly here. The first falls under the health and wellness umbrella. On average, one school psychologist and guidance counselor serves 310 students in rural schools. But this indicator is a really good example of how widely access to services can vary from state to state. And what I mean by that is rural students in some states experience ratios of more than 400 to 1, while others fare significantly better, such as in New Hampshire, where the ratio is 149 to 1. So number 2, not surprisingly, there is a strong correlation between access to supports for learning and development with poor educational outcomes. States that need to pay more attention to learning and development usually also need to pay attention to learning outcomes. These two measures tend to go hand in hand. And number 3, the report also reports that white students are overrepresented in rural gifted and talented programming. For example, despite 17% of students in rural schools identifying as Hispanic, Hispanic students make up only 9% of students in gifted programs in their rural districts. Likewise, more than 10% of rural students are Black, but Black children make up only 5% of those receiving gifted programs. We also know that rural schools offset some of the impacts of poverty. Although in every state, rural students from homes with incomes below the poverty line score lower on the NAEP in both reading and math than students who don't, in most states, the differences were smaller among rural schools than non-rural schools, which is an advantage for rural children who live in homes below the poverty line. COVID made clear that adequate internet connectivity is an issue of equity, but more than 13% of rural households lack minimum broadband access, and in 6 states, that percentage is over 16%, which is more than 1 in 6 households. And finally, nationally, in the majority of states, rural students graduate from high school at rates higher than their non-rural peers. This is called the rural graduation advantage. However, there were exceptions, and in 2 states, Arizona and Alaska, the rural graduation rate was more than 3 percentage points lower than the non-rural graduation rate. Although those differences appear really small, in Alaska, for example, if rural students had graduated at the same rate as non-rural students, an additional 200 to 250 students would have graduated from their rural high schools. And next, Dan will share some Oklahoma-specific findings.
Thanks, Karen. So, like I said, there's these 25 indicators. I'm just gonna kind of flash them gauge by gauge on the screen. So you're gonna see 5 at a time. What you will see is the Oklahoma's data. So that would be in the first column here, and then the second column says what they rank relative to the other states. So, for example, percent rural schools is 53.4%. So over half of the schools in Oklahoma are located in one of those rural areas that we looked at, those green areas earlier on. And this positions Oklahoma as 7th in the US in terms of how high that percent of rural schools is. So actually on all 5 of these indicators, Oklahoma is right up there, either at or very near the top quartile among all the states. So in Oklahoma, as all of you are well aware, rural does play a heavy role in the overall health of education in the state, and it certainly should. This is the kind of data you want to be using with other legislators as well, just showing how crucial, just in case that message isn't coming through, that rural education is crucial, and this is how it ended up here, crucial to the health of education in Oklahoma. The overall rank was third. In other words, out of the 50 states, there was only 2 states that ranked higher in terms of rural importance than Oklahoma did. So Oklahoma is an extremely rural-centric state. If I'm looking through these specific indicators, and you might, if anything there strikes you as strange or curious, that's something you could put in the chat and we can talk more about later. One thing I do notice is that not only are over half of the schools in Oklahoma in rural areas, but a lot of those school districts are very small. So this small rural districts means that the rural districts are are smaller than the national median. And again, Oklahoma is one of the highest states in the country on those small rural districts. And we can talk more about why that might be important later on as well. In terms of raw number of students, we have almost 200,000 that are in rural districts. And you can see that about a third of the state funding is going to rural districts right now. Okay, even more pressing than the rural importance is the diversity. And again, this is not a bad thing. This is something to be aware of, how diverse. You're probably well aware already that Oklahoma is a diverse state, but to see that it's ranked second in the entire US is a pretty strong place to be here. So if we look at the diversity index, this one's a little bit strange. If you can follow with me here for about 10 seconds. If you were to go into any rural school, just an arbitrary rural school in Oklahoma, and pluck out 2 students at random, what's the chance that they would identify as different races or ethnicities? And in Oklahoma, that's over 50%, 55.5. That's the second highest in the entire US in terms of diversity. It's an extremely diverse state, and not just in pockets of schools. Within the given schools, there's a lot of racial diversity at a higher level than almost anywhere in the country. The poverty level is pretty high. Again, 13th place, this 245, what this is looking at is, it's an estimate for poverty. So it's looking at the households that are around the rural schools. So you're looking at schools all over the state, and then you're taking a bunch of the households nearby those rural schools. And when you average that all together, the average income is 245% of the poverty line. So just a little over double the poverty line, which is pretty low. This is pretty low relative to rural neighborhoods in the rest of the US. The IEP percent is one of the highest, third highest in the US. And then the rural school age children, this is more at the child level. So 15, about 1 in 6 children in a rural school district in Oklahoma are below the poverty line. Their household is below the poverty line. Mobility is just saying what percent of the students have moved residences within the last 12 months, because that can cause a lot of stress on the student, but also a lot of stress on the teacher, the classroom, the educational environment. And again, in Oklahoma, that's very high. Over 1 in 10 students have moved within the last 12 months. Policy here. Here, Oklahoma falls more mid-range, but it's not that they're kind of middle of the road on all the indicators. It tends to be one end of the continuum or the other. So in terms of financial indicators, how much Oklahoma spends per pupil on instruction, That 5,600, that's one of the lowest. So by rank 6, that's one of the least amount of money spent per pupil in the US. And also the salary expenditures for teacher, and this has been adjusted based on the cost of something like the cost of living. So it has been adjusted to try to make an equal comparison across the US. And again, one of the lowest salaries on average in the country. So those, they're very small. On the other end, this median organizational scale. So Oklahoma schools are very small. Sometimes there can be negative impacts when you have really large consolidated districts. Oklahoma doesn't have that problem near to the degree that most other states have. Most of the schools and districts are relatively small at this point. And then the instruction to transportation expenditures is almost the best in the US in terms of there's not a lot of burden on the school budgets relative to what the burden is in other places in the US. Oklahoma school districts don't have to spend as much on those transportation expenditures. Okay, and then the state revenue, this is just kind of where the funding source comes from, and Oklahoma is kind of middle of the road on that. Educational outcomes, again, we have kind of a two-end distribution here. So when we look at the raw scores of math and reading, Oklahoma's 4th and 8th, what that says is they're some of the lowest scores in the US in terms of these NAEP outcomes. However, the good news is there is not as much differential between students of poverty and students who are not living in poverty in Oklahoma. In rural Oklahoma, in a lot of states, you see a pretty big gap between the students of poverty, the rural students of poverty, and the rural students who are not living in poverty. There's a pretty big educational performance gap. In Oklahoma, we're not seeing that gap as much. So that is some good news there. And also the high school graduation rate. Rural Advantage, this is one of the higher ones in the US. What this means is the rural Oklahoma students are graduating high school at a rate that's 3.9 percentage points higher than the non-rural students of Oklahoma, which is a pretty big difference there. And then finally, access to support. This is our newest gauge that Karen had mentioned. Some things that jump out at me here is the amount of, Karen mentioned the amount of students that were lacking broadband access, and that was at the national level. Here at Oklahoma, we see that's a fairly substantial concern in Oklahoma as well. 15.4% of the rural households don't have that broadband access, which brings with it a lot of educational equity. And we also see the health insurance, which adds extra layers. I'm certainly seeing this at the university level as well, where students who are struggling with health concerns or family members struggling with health concerns or financial concerns are not able to be fully present in the classroom to the same level. So this is something well worth noting. Public preschool enrollment is actually really high in rural Oklahoma. Almost half of the students in rural areas do attend a public preschool. And there's actually more females than males, although this doesn't really say math versus English. A lot of places in the US, the females are underrepresented in math gifted programs. And I don't have that data available here. But overall, there's slightly more females than males in gifted programs. Karen mentioned the psychologist school counselor ratio in Oklahoma, 349 students per counselor. And with the rising mental health needs, especially in the wake of COVID, you can imagine how that can cause issues to have that limited access to that professional support. Okay, Karen, do you mind taking this slide and then I'll jump back in?
So we'll look next at how Oklahoma compares to other states on their scores, again, comprised of their scores on each indicators in each of the 5 gauges. So again, the average of the 5 gauge scores with their 5 indicators resulted in a numerically ranked state list divided into quartiles. The lower the score, the higher a state's overall rank, indicating the greatest concern and higher priority. So the smaller the number, the greater the concern. You can see here that Oklahoma ranks 8th in concern as compared to Mississippi that ranks 1st. But again, to reiterate, Dan already said this, but the state ranking shouldn't be interpreted to suggest that rural education in low priority states doesn't need increased attention from policymakers. Every state faces challenges in providing a high quality education for its rural children. But the highest priority states in this report are those states where key factors converge to present the most extreme challenges for rural schooling, suggesting the most urgent needs for policymaker attention. Dan, will you talk next about the multilingual learners?
Yes, for sure. So one of the fastest growing populations in rural areas is the multilingual learner population. And you can see here, these are across the entire United States, that not only has the raw number been increasing, the absolute number of multilingual learners, but the percent that they make of the overall rural student body has also been increasing. Because of some shifts in data reporting standards and where the data were housed, we only found reliable data on multilingual learners after our initial report was released. And so this is why we've included a separate, this is actually a 26 indicator of sorts in the report. It's towards the end, there's every state, and you can see rural Oklahoma, for example, 2.7% of the rural students are multilingual learners currently. So a little over 5,000 there. And then you can see how that compares to bordering states. Arkansas and especially Texas is a much higher rate. Kansas, a little bit lower than Oklahoma's rate. I want to review some of the resources that accompany this year's report. We're almost done here, and then we can address some of these questions. So I want to start off by acknowledging the amazing work that Suzanne Amos did in pulling all of the stuff together and making the report actionable for users. This data dashboard allows users to interact with the data, so you don't need to just rely on the end result that is provided in the report. You can actually go in and play around with this now. This is something new. We've never done this in earlier versions of the report. Users can select a state, multiple states, either by typing into the search box at the top right or clicking on the map. And then the right side column will display rankings for the 5 key gauges and indicators. The left side displays values for all the gauges and indicators for the selected state or states. And then to download state level data for all 50 states, click on the link in the bottom left here, that down arrow there. We'd like to acknowledge Charlie Mix, the Director of Geographic Information Systems at UT Chattanooga, for developing this data dashboard. Another thing we have is our communications toolkit. So the communications toolkit includes several resources to aid report users such as yourself. Everything needed to communicate with the varied constituencies, including a report summary and highlights, FAQs, materials for producing your own state-specific communications, graphics, a news release template with background info and national results, and then you can just add in Oklahoma or whatever state info that you want to emphasize in a PowerPoint slide deck, again, with some background info and national results. And here's another look at what some of those resources there in the toolkit. And I assume that this presentation will be available to, I think it's going to be posted on the state page. I'll let Erica speak to that later. Finally, here's another website for where you can find the report itself, although that QR code could also be used to access the report. If you have questions in general, you could write Alan. You can also write me if you have questions about the data, and we can dig into some of the specific questions that are in the chat as well here at this point. So I'm going to stop my sharing. And Erica, did you want to mention anything or
Yeah,
mediate anything here?
so we'll go through the questions here in a second, but you did mention, so for those of you who are taking notes, this is going to be we're recording this probably over the weekend. I will get this uploaded to our website, and then I will send a follow-up email to everybody who registered with the link for that. Also, on the website, we'll put, access where you can get links to access all of those things. I did have a question. Is that dashboard available within just kind of the main link for Rural Matters?
It would be just on the, yeah, it should be either that or on the NREA page.
Okay.
I can double check that.
I just put the link in the chat.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Okay, let's see. So yeah, you guys will have access to review this. You'll have access to share it with your colleagues if you'd like to do that. This will all be available. And again, I will send it out to everybody via email once I am able to get everything loaded up over the weekend. So we've got a couple of questions. Let me scroll down. So could we go back to the state appropriations data slide? We have a question from Senator Hicks. Senator Hicks is one of our wonderful public education advocates up at the Capitol. She works very hard for us. And she wants to know, did the state appropriations data consider communities who are off the formula and ad valorem disbursements? So in Oklahoma, our funding formula is actually one of the most equitable funding formulas out there. We just don't fund it very well. But hang on, let me pull up the chat. I lost it. So in Oklahoma, we have districts that are wealthier than other districts. So part of the funding comes from local ad valorem taxes, and then part of the funding comes from the state for it to, and then it kind of equalizes and balances out. So if you have a lower income community that has less ad valorem, then the state is paying more dollars in to get them to that per pupil expenditure versus a wealthy. We've got some districts that have ad valorem that surpasses the state funding. So that's what we call off the formula. They're not receiving any state funding. So Senator Hicks's question is, did the state appropriations data include and consider communities who are off the formula and the ad valorem disbursements? Or was that just simply what the state is paying their portion for?
And I think it was, I'm sorry, it was the previous slide, not the one that we're currently looking at. I think it was the one right preceding this one. Oh,
Here we go.
there it is.
Percent of state education funds.
Correct.
Okay. So could you clarify one more time, either Erica or Carrie, the off the formula, are these like indigenous communities or?
So these are districts that are deemed to have such high local resources that they do not qualify or are ineligible for state aid. Does that make sense? So there's no state appropriation to those school districts. And I believe it's anywhere from 40 to 50 school districts that we have. And I mean, a lot of them are in rural communities with wind farms or Google, things like that, that have a very profound impact in that community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the way this would have been determined, it would have been a ratio. So it would have looked at all the funding that's going to rural districts the state funding over the total amount of state funding going to other districts. So if the state funding wasn't going to a district at all, then it wouldn't really be part of this, because this would only be the state funding to the rural districts on top, divided by the state funding to any district. So if it was a district where there wasn't state funding, yeah, it wouldn't really be reflected here. Is that answering your question?
Sorry, I was having trouble getting to my unmute somewhat. I mean, I think I think it does impact through the funding formula what those communities do receive in state aid. And so I was just curious. Also on the ad valorem disbursement payments, I previously taught in a school district that received a very low state aid appropriation through state resources. But folks would say it's because they have a very high ad valorem reimbursement because of the oil leases that were near the school. And I just didn't know if you all had looked into that or considered kind of the multi-tiered funding streams that we have, particularly for our rural schools.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Carrie. And that's also a good opportunity to mention how when we're looking at the national level, it's kind of this bird's eye view of the data. And so some of those nuances of different regional areas, those ad valorem disbursements, that would be the kind of thing that this would be perfect for someone in Oklahoma to pull this data as a starting point and then dig into some of those specifics, because it wouldn't probably be addressed at this national level.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. Okay. Do you have, when you go, can you go to the diversity slide? And when we talk about Oklahoma ranking #2 and as urgent as they are kind of in that diversity index, we're one of the highest diversity index in the nation in rural areas. Do you have any data that further drills down to what that diversity index is reflecting? So for example, David Blatt with Appleseed had time to comment in that, is it possible that our high diversity index is surely it's due to because we have such a large rural native population? Do you have it broken down on that level as far as race, or is it just more high level?
No, so that we do have broken down at a fine grain level. So we could, I don't have it right here. That's something that would have to be as part of the data set. But I could be available for follow-up questions to dig in a little deeper and see very precisely where that's coming from. Now, something that's interesting with the rural native population is there are some states where you have a fairly sizable population, but because they tend to attend schools together, they're enrolled in rural schools together. That particular school, let's say it's 98% rural native, that school would actually have a very low diversity index. So this is really talking about the blending of races and ethnicities, not just the presence statewide. So that'd be something very interesting. If it is coming from that rural native population, then that means that there's a lot of integration. It's not just that there's large numbers that are clustered together in pockets, but that there's quite a bit of integration, more so than in some of the other states that have large rural native populations.
I would be interested in maybe following up with you next week or something to figure out how we can get, excuse me, our hands on that information. I would just be interested to know what
Sure.
that looks like on a more granular level. Okay, so the next one was the slide with transportation. If you can go to that one. The transportation, I think it was a ratio maybe.
I think I got
Oh,
it here. I
ratio
think
of instructional to transportation expenditures. That was surprising to me, to be honest, that we were as low. And Senator Hicks, do you know, Senator Hicks, do you know when that new weighting for transportation was implemented? Was that last session?
It was last session, so it's kind of maybe a no-brainer that it's probably not captured in this data. But it is my understanding that that would have been adjusted for this current school year.
So for the researchers on, then we passed a bill last session that added new weighting to that transportation, and basically kind of it bumped the dollar amount up that we're receiving from the state for transportation. Was this data, would that have include that change that took place last spring, or would this data
this would have been
Right.
before that change,
Okay.
just before, yeah. So it'll be really interesting to see in the next report. The plan is to do these every 2 years,
right?
to see now with that policy switch, what does this do to that indicator?
Yeah. So I'm curious to know, so if we're ranked 47th, we're doing pretty well. Um, is there anything in the data that would indicate why we seem to be doing better than other states in this? This is just one of the ones that really surprised me.
Well, I can tell you some of the worst states in the country are ones where there's been these large consolidation efforts over the years. So West Virginia is one that pops into mind. Every school district in West Virginia is at the county level because, they pulled from all these small schools that have been combined. And so now you have students who are riding an hour and a half, even in some crazy cases, like 2 hours to school because they're so far away from that consolidated school. And then that takes the transportation costs way high. So Oklahoma is on the other end of that. They, in terms of this median organizational scale, you can see that they're one of the smallest schools and districts. They don't, at least on the surface, as far as I can tell, there's not as much of this consolidation. And there's still those small districts too. So in some ways, those small districts would have at least lower in terms of the mileage from school to student's house.
That makes sense. I think definitely in that southeastern Oklahoma where you showed we had more of the remote rural, there's a lot of small districts that aren't very far apart, versus northwestern Oklahoma and the Panhandle. I know we've got a school district up there, Boise City, that is 1,500 square miles. But for the most part, I think there, that would make sense. So thank you for answering that. That makes sense to me. Okay, so we've got, let's see, I'm scrolling through here. Comments. Yeah, our funding formula is definitely different from a lot of states. And then the others were mainly just comments. So do we have any other questions? If you guys want to type them in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask. At this point, if we're going to get into specific questions, if you need to log off, you're not interested in that, you can, or you can stay on. We're going to go ahead and record this. But if anybody has any other questions that they'd like to just throw out, go ahead and unmute yourself or type them in the chat. Either way. It's good. I have a question. So when we look at all of this data and we kind of parse through it and process it through our brains, what is the best way for us to, how do I phrase this question? Turn what we found in this data into something positive for our advocacy efforts. Or maybe another way to phrase it is, when you look at our data specific to Oklahoma, as a researcher who's been looking at this for a long time, what do you think are kind of our most crucial areas that we might want to focus on policy development and advocacy towards?
Yeah, that's a great question, Erica. I would say that in Oklahoma, so there's maybe two ways you could use this data. Almost like a bad news, good news type of way. The bad news might be areas where things aren't going so well in Oklahoma, like the broadband access or like the health insurance. And so in that case, where the news is somewhat urgent, using these data when applying for federal grants or not doesn't have to be federal grants, like outside grants. That would be a place of actionable use of these, or talking about them in legislation and policy making. At the same time, there's some things that Oklahoma is doing very well, like the maintenance of those small schools and districts. Um, so spreading those stories too, and it pays off too, because I mean, Oklahoma, you saw, had one of the highest graduation rates, high school graduation rates in their rural areas relative to the non-rural areas. And so I think you do see some of the benefits of those smaller communities and those centralized communities coming into play there. And that's a great story to spread.
Yeah. The other question I had is, can you pull up that mental health
Sure.
ratio slide?
This one here.
Yes. And so what were so number one, what was there? I mean, we're up there. We're not in the top 10, but 349 seems super sad to me. You mentioned New
Mhm.
Hampshire was like 100 and something, right?
Right, yeah, 149.
149. And so what are some of the things that, this is just a personal thing for me that I am really passionate about, having struggled, within my own household with children's mental health. And knowing that right now we're in a situation where unfortunately we have a State Department that is walking away from mental health grants and federal dollars. What are some of those states that are, and you may not know the answer to this question, but those states that are doing better than us, which is a lot of them, what are some lessons that we can learn from them or pull from them to improve that ranking? Specific to I guess, the school counselor ratio.
Mhm. Um, so a couple things to mention there, and Karen, you can speak up then also if you want. So this included all psychologists and school counselors all together. So it's even a little worse than it seems, because you're already 349 students to a psychologist or school counselor. So you could go into the data and look specifically at school counselors if that was something you're interested in. The psychologists and the school counselors are represented separately in the data. So that would be one thing you could explore. You could look at other states and, contact. This would be, again, the report itself would be a starting place for some of
Right.
these little tunnel explorations or follow-up. So someone who did have interest in mental health could go in and look at some of those states, maybe contact people in those states and find out what's happening. I should also mention, I can't remember if Karen said this or not, but not only do you have rural Oklahoma compared to rural other states, but then there's the rural areas of the US compared to the non-rural areas. And in those non-rural areas, the access was easier. There was higher numbers of psychologists and school counselors in those non-rural areas. So there's also the rural non-rural divide there. So there's lots of things that the data could give as a starting point, and then from that point on, it's conversations and
Yeah.
stories to find out what's going on.
Are we able to access through that dashboard? So if you looked at Oklahoma, are we able to access this mental health in rural versus the non-rural? Are we able to see that in the dashboard, or is that something we'd have to get from you guys?
Not from the dashboard, but if you send me an email, I'm happy to show
Okay.
you how to do it or pull the numbers for you or anything like that.
Okay. Great.
I
Yeah.
could just make one point briefly about instructional spending. To me, that this issue of counselor access is very closely related to instructional spending. And in Oklahoma, that number is just a little over $5,000 per, and it ranks 6th. So only 5 states in the nation are funding their schools worse, to just, bluntly say that, than Oklahoma. So it tracks, right? That the spending, the access to mental health services is limited when the instructional spending is $5,000 per student.
Yeah.
Right. So I just wanted to kind of draw that the reason why schools aren't doing this is that they can barely, and the salaries are also low. Right. So when you can barely afford to staff your 4th grade, then decisions have to be made. And unfortunately, right, that's an outcome of that, to me, that per pupil spending. I mean, that's an oversimplification for sure, but
Yeah.
I just draw that line that the money coming into instructional spending is highly relevant to access to mental health services.
I would agree with you wholeheartedly on that. All right, well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions in the chat. Does anybody else want to weigh in with a question before we sign off? Yes,
Yeah,
I have
do that.
somebody in.
Are we clear, or is there somebody else wanting the mic? I'll be
You
glad
go
to use
ahead. You've got the mic.
it. Okay, thank you. I'm Brian Turner. I live in Tulsa, but I'm extremely interested in our connections with our rural partners as well. I'm working with a group of people on eradicating poverty. We are starting a group of small grassroots conversations, hoping that will build into something really big. Because I don't get that anybody's really talking about poverty in Oklahoma. And you would think from looking at our rankings, it'd be something akin to 911 all over again. I mean, our rankings are so dismal that somebody's got to be taking this as some kind of crisis, and we're just not. Now, I don't know if we can return to the poverty page or not, but I'd like to take a look at that again, because I've heard it said, I was out in rural areas, I was out in mounds about a year ago, and our guide in a park said the poverty areas may be tough in a rural, in our urban areas, but in our rural areas, it's like the Depression all over again. Like poverty is huge and it's pervasive. I'd like people to kind of respond to that if they could in a while, and tell me a little bit more about that. I'm sorry if I'm so inexact.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think poverty has been a very tricky thing to measure in the past couple years, because for a long time we measured it with the free and reduced lunch rate, and that has kind of gone downhill. The schools stopped reporting it. There were schools that were just getting 100% anyway. There was several reasons that no longer really gave a good measure of poverty. And good news is there are some things on the horizon, some measures NCES is looking at to potentially get a more like precise measures so that we can channel the resources more effectively. Here we're looking at 2 different angles of that poverty. One looking at the communities around the rural schools, and one just the households where the rural children are living. But neither of these are a complete picture either. So yeah, I mean, again, Brian, I would say this is kind of one of those things where this is a starting point that then you go off into this direction. And what I could do, if it would be helpful, I could provide a spreadsheet with all of the schools or districts in Oklahoma and what the poverty level is for that neighborhood, that school neighborhood. So the households that are living near the rural schools or non-rurals. You mentioned Tulsa. I could just give it all the Oklahoma ones, and you could, investigate that a little more, like what regional patterns do you see?
That would be great. I would love to have it. Brian, is that something that you'd like for us to get for you too?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Secondly, could you help me go over again the percent, the poverty level in rural school communities and the figure of 245%?
Mm,
Help me understand that number better.
sure. Yeah, this one's probably one of our trickiest indicators.
Well, thank
So
you.
yeah, it starts off at, if you picture the entire state and picture every rural school kind of as a dot on the map, in Oklahoma, every rural school. And then for each school, you're going to try to get a measure of poverty, like the households living around that school. How much wealth do they have? Like are they double the poverty line, triple, quadruple the poverty line? Like on average, where do those school neighborhood households, where do they fall relative to the poverty line? And in Oklahoma in particular, this 245% would mean once we averaged household incomes, and you have to adjust for size of the households. We're using census data to do this, adjusting for the size of the households because the poverty line's higher, for different size households. But once we've done all that adjustment, on average, a household near an Oklahoma rural school is going to be at 2.45, about 2.5 times the poverty line for
Okay.
whatever household size they would be,
Got
which
it.
I don't know if that sounds good or not, but that's low relative to what we see across some of the northeastern states are, 4, 5,
Oh, I see.
100% times that poverty line on average.
Oh, I see. So it might be helpful then to take a look at where Oklahoma is positioned within
Yeah.
a lot of
Mhm.
the other states, and maybe
And there in the report, there's a page that does precisely that.
I'm sorry, David, I walked all over your explanation. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I just said there's a page in the report that does exactly that, which looks at this particular indicator, and then you see all 50 states at once and how they play out.
Got it. Got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
We will follow up with that and we will get that to you, Brian. And anybody else that wants it, we'll just add it in the follow-up email. So anybody else on here that would like to see it, it'll be added to that. I think Senator Hicks had a really salient point. She said, a high-level consideration on the deep felt effects of poverty would be lack of local nonprofits at the scale of urban areas. That's something that I never thought about. But when you think about food banks and some of the other nonprofit things that you find in more suburban and urban communities, that's another factor. In rural Oklahoma, you just don't have that as much.
That's definitely true.
Let's see, I think, okay, Rochelle asked, do you think that our poverty level is affected by legalized medical marijuana? And do you think our casinos have an effect?
Yeah, great questions. Those would probably be more again at that state level where people who, like yourselves, who know the state better would take that data to figure out the why behind what you're seeing here.
Yeah.
Those certainly could be things that contribute.
And I haven't looked at the poverty map, and I know you mentioned that, measuring poverty in school districts by the free reduced lunch is no longer as specific for a lot of reasons post-COVID.
Mhm.
But I know previously in the past, we've done some looking at data to see kind of where our higher free reduced lunch communities tend to be. And in general, again, this was pre-COVID, probably back in 2019, but in general, if I remember, that seemed to be more localized in that southeastern quadrant of the state, that southeastern Oklahoma, was struggling with that. It would be interesting, not that it could correlate directly, but it'd be interesting to see when you overlay, what's going on where our casinos are, if that, if that matched up at all. I don't know. but I think that's a great question.
These kind of questions are exactly what we hope the report would do, that we have this large kind of state snapshot of rural schools that does not take into account localized differences among rural communities within the state.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that exactly the kind of questions that you're asking is what we want each state to be doing. Okay, so we see this diversity index 55.5%. So what does that mean for this area or that area? Or what are the trends or conditions that could be influencing that number? Like these are exactly what the kind of things that we're hoping that the report can do. It's a stepping off point from a statewide kind of bird's eye view of rural schools and communities in the state of Oklahoma.
Well, thank you guys for providing this step off point for us with all of this incredible data. And there were some, for me, I can speak for myself only, but there were some surprising things in the data and some things that I fully expected to be in the data. And so thank you for doing all of your hard work and researching this and bringing it to us this evening so that we can now take it and roll with it as an advocacy community to start identifying, like you said, where are some areas that we could drill this down a little bit more and produce some meaningful legislation out of it. So thank you to all of you for joining us, whether you're from Quapaw or Batiste or the Panhandle or Pennsylvania or wherever you're dialing in from. We're so glad that all of you were here to join us this evening, and we look forward to working with you as we kind of sort through this data and figure out ideas on how we can use this in a positive manner. If any of you have any ideas around that or anything else you would like to explore, you can also feel free to reach out to me. OK Rural Schools Coalition at gmail.com. And our website is okruralschools.org. And again, we will send a follow-up email with the link to this recording and any of the other, I think the spreadsheet for the poverty that we can provide to Ryan, and anything else. I'll go back through and make sure we didn't miss anything. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday evening and an even better weekend. Now we're done. Bye.